In 1966, American patrols were being ambushed before they even realized the Viet Cong were near. Casualties mounted. Frustration grew. Nothing seemed to work. Then, American commanders noticed something strange. A small group of Australian SAS patrols operating in the same terrain weren't struggling at all. Their kill ratio wasn't just higher, it was 3 times higher. How were a few hundred Australians succeeding where thousands of Americans could not? The United States entered Vietnam with doctrines forged in World War II. Large sweeps, heavy footsteps, overwhelming firepower. These tactics had crushed armies in Europe and the Pacific. But the jungle didn't care about past victories. American units moved in platoons, sometimes companies. They made noise. They left trails. The Viet Cong heard them coming from hundreds of meters away. By the time the Americans arrived, the enemy had vanished into the green. Or worse, they were waiting in ambush. Units were getting hit hard. Morale was cracking. Commanders realized they were fighting the wrong type of war. A superpower had walked into a jungle that didn't care about rank, technology, or numbers. Then came the Australians. The Australian SAS arrived in Vietnam in 1966, but their story began years earlier. They traced their lineage to the British SAS, the elite force that had redefined unconventional warfare. More importantly, they carried lessons from the Malayan Emergency, where British and Australian forces spent years hunting communist insurgents in dense jungle. They had done this before. They knew how to move, how to watch, how to wait. American commanders noticed their effectiveness immediately. Small Australian patrols were slipping into Viet Cong-controlled territory and coming back with confirmed kills, captured supplies, and critical intelligence. No drama, no casualties, just results. To understand how the Australians tripled the kill ratio, we need to understand what they knew and what America didn't. The SAS didn't fight against the jungle. They became part of it. Their patrols were small, 5 men, sometimes 4. They moved in absolute silence. No unnecessary words, no wasted movement. Every sound was deliberate. Every step was tested before weight was committed. They studied the jungle like a language. The way leaves turned, the direction birds flew, the smell of recently disturbed earth, the absence of insect noise. To the SAS, these weren't details. They were survival. They didn't search for the enemy. They tracked him. Footprints told them how many men had passed. The depth of the print revealed their weight. The direction of broken twigs showed where they were headed. The Australians could read a trail like a book. And when they found the enemy, they didn't rush. They waited. They positioned themselves perfectly. They controlled the kill zone. They ensured every shot would count. The Australians weren't just soldiers. They were professional hunters, and the Viet Cong were their prey. Their kill ratio wasn't luck. It was discipline and doctrine applied with surgical precision. The SAS set ambushes with perfect geometry. They studied approaches. They calculated firing lanes. They positioned themselves where the enemy would be most exposed and least able to respond. When they opened fire, it was devastating and brief. They never fired unless they were certain. Wasting ammunition meant resupply. Resupply meant noise. Noise meant compromise. Every bullet had to matter. They reverse-tracked Viet Cong patrols. If they found a trail, they didn't follow it forward. They followed it backward, to staging areas, to camps, to supply caches. This gave them intelligence that shaped operations for weeks. They read terrain like tacticians. Weight shifts and footprints told them if a man was carrying a heavy load. Spacing between steps revealed urgency or caution. Direction changes showed hesitation or confidence. and they avoided ambushes the moment the jungle went quiet. Silence meant the enemy was near. The SAS would halt, assess, and either withdraw or reposition to strike from an unexpected angle. One patrol stopped mid-step. A single leaf was turned the wrong way. The Australians knew someone had passed through minutes earlier. They sensed an ambush forming ahead. Instead of walking into it, they moved around the killing zone and struck from behind. The Viet Cong never knew what hit them. This was the SAS advantage. Total awareness, total patience, total control. American commanders began sending advisors to observe SAS patrols. What they saw shocked them. The Australians moved slower than the Americans thought possible. A patrol might cover 2 kilometers in 6 hours. They stopped constantly, listened, watched, adjusted. They used terrain instead of fighting it. They moved through low ground where noise was absorbed. They avoided ridgelines where silhouettes could be seen. They crossed streams at bends where water masked sound. The Americans had been trained to move with purpose and aggression. The SAS moved with patience and invisibility. It was a completely different philosophy of war. Respect grew. And with respect came imitation. If the Americans wanted to survive, they had to relearn how to fight. And the Australians were about to show them how. Young American soldiers began joining SAS patrols as observers. It was a cultural shock. No talking. Hand signals only. No large packs filled with extra gear. No metal that could clink. No predictable formations. No walking at normal speed. The Australians moved at a crawl. They froze for minutes at a time. They tested every branch before pushing it aside. They breathed quietly. They became ghosts. Americans described it like following shadows. The patrol wasn't moving through the jungle. It was flowing through it. One soldier said it felt like being part of a ritual, something ancient and precise. At first, the Americans were frustrated. This was too slow, too cautious. But then, they started to see what the SAS saw. The jungle wasn't random. It was readable. Broken spider webs meant recent movement. Mud on leaves meant someone had slipped. Crushed vegetation pointed in the direction of travel. The enemy left signs everywhere. Ambushes had patterns. The Viet Cong preferred certain terrain. They set up near water sources. They used thick vegetation for concealment. They positioned themselves where trails narrowed. Once you understood the pattern, you could predict the ambush. Slowness wasn't weakness. It was survival. Speed got you killed. Discipline won firefights. The Americans began to understand why the SAS kill ratio was so high. It wasn't about being better shots. It was about being better observers. The SAS rarely walked into ambushes because they saw them coming. For the first time, American troops weren't reacting to ambushes. They were predicting them. The change spread quickly. Never S. Units began adopting SAS-style patrolling. Recon teams shrank dramatically. Instead of squads, they sent out 4- or 5-man teams. Movement became deliberate. Noise discipline became mandatory. Soldiers were taught to read terrain and track enemy movement. Long-range reconnaissance patrol teams, the LRRPs, began copying SAS stealth doctrine. They trained in silence. They learned patience. They stopped trying to dominate the jungle and started blending into it. Firepower became secondary to awareness. Commanders realized that preventing contact was more valuable than winning contact. The goal shifted from finding the enemy to understanding where he was without being detected. American officers finally understood why the SAS kill ratio was so high. The Australians weren't better fighters. They were better at avoiding unnecessary fights and dominating the ones they chose. But the biggest change was still coming, and it would reshape U.S. special operations for decades. The influence of the Australian SAS didn't end in Vietnam. It became embedded in the DNA of American special operations. The LRRPs evolved into the modern 75th Ranger Regiment. Their reconnaissance doctrine, their small unit tactics, their emphasis on stealth, all traced back to lessons learned in Vietnam, lessons taught by the Australians. Green Berets reinforced their jungle discipline. They had always valued unconventional warfare, but the SAS showed them what true fieldcraft looked like: the patience, the silence, the invisible movement. SEAL teams adopted SAS-style reconnaissance. Their emphasis on small patrols, detailed observation, and controlled engagement reflected Australian influence. The philosophy of becoming part of the environment rather than dominating it. Delta Force traced early fieldcraft principles to both British and Australian SAS models. The focus on selection, discipline, and operational independence mirrored the SAS ethos. SOG recon teams, some of the most elite units in Vietnam, used Australian-style movement. They learned to track, to read terrain, to avoid compromise. The most dangerous missions required the quietest soldiers. Modern U.S. small unit tactics are rooted in SAS philosophy. The emphasis on situational awareness, terrain exploitation, and controlled violence. These weren't American inventions. They were Australian teachings. America entered Vietnam as a superpower. It left with the fieldcraft of an elite hunter, thanks to a few hundred Australians. But there was a cost the world rarely speaks about. SAS patrols were short, but brutally intense. Days of absolute silence, constant vigilance. The psychological weight of knowing that one mistake, one sound, one moment of carelessness could get your entire patrol killed. Many SAS veterans seldom spoke about what they endured, not because they wanted glory, but because the jungle had taught them something most soldiers never learn: that survival isn't about courage. It's about discipline so complete it becomes instinct. The SAS never asked for credit, and that is exactly why they deserve it. The Australian SAS didn't just fight in Vietnam. They reshaped how America fights its wars. From the jungles of Southeast Asia to the deserts of the Middle East, their doctrine became doctrine. Their patience became standard. Their quiet professionalism became the model for every elite unit that followed. Firepower wins battles, but mastery, true mastery, changes doctrine. And in Vietnam, the Australians mastered the jungle.